Hello everybody, welcome to Module 3, The Science of Emotions. In this module, we're going to be looking at emotions, and you're going to be reading, among other things, Chapter 11 of your online textbook. This video is designed as an introduction to a chapter that I think is going to be a little bit challenging, partly because of the competing nature of the theories. So do your best. You'll be able to do it for sure. Just read very carefully, make sure that you do your underlining, and make sure that you go back to your notes and you review them. So we're going to step up here a little bit, folks. This is going to be a little bit of a challenge. Let's jump in. I think that part of the difficulty we have with the study of emotions comes down to us through history. For thousands of years, emotions have been suspect and seen as the enemy and the antithesis to reason. The ancient Greeks called the emotions the passions, and they believed that they were the cause of our tragedies. In order to avoid suffering, man must use reason to battle all feelings. The Greek Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that reason alone was good. The emotional and irrational mental states were intolerable. Marcus Aurelius, who is known as one of the 5 good emperors and was also a Stoic philosopher, taught that emotions must come under the control of reasons. From the quotes that you can see here, you can see that Stoicism believed not only could the mind control the emotions, but that the good life, the happy life, was one with the irrational and dangerous emotions kept clearly in check. One of the first psychologists, who was also a philosopher, William James, inherited this long tradition in Western thinking that favors reason over emotion. He sounds like a Stoic philosopher when he says that a human being can alter his life by changing his attitudes. One of the first theories of emotions that we're going to be looking at is called the James-Lange Theory, and it was proposed at the beginning of the 20th century when psychology was still in its infancy as a scientific discipline. It's really rather remarkable because in 1890, when this book was written and this theory was proposed, psychology didn't have the measuring tools that we have today. In stark contrast to a thinker like William James, who valued the study of the mind, comes B.F. Skinner, whose focus was on behavior instead of mental states. So this very famous psychologist, who taught at Harvard in the 50s and 60s, and in the 70s published 2 of his most influential books, he believed that you simply could not study emotions because you could not measure them. The only thing that's observable and measurable is behavior. Emotions and other mental constructs were useless for scientific study precisely because they cannot be quantified. Science must study what can be quantified. Behavior can be measured, and so in this way, behaviorism became the dominant psychology of the 1970s. And B.F. Skinner is famous for saying, "Give me a child and I will shape him into anything." So what are emotions? There is no one definition that everybody agrees on. Some say that emotions are individual specific reactions to experiences. Others say that emotions are sensitivity to events. Yet others say your mind's reaction to experience, intangible human feelings, powerful internal sensations that color and affect every single perception and experience that we might have. How do we go about studying this? Some of the difficulty in studying emotions is that beyond what we can actually see is going on in the brain and perhaps measure what's going on in the body, increased heart rate, sweaty palms, all of the rest of those bodily arousal states, we really have to rely on people self-reporting what it is that they are experiencing. And so this has always been and continues to be one of the difficult things in the science of emotions or studying emotions, because the experience is in part subjective and variable and almost impossible to quantify. Our Western view of the world has taught us that emotions and reason, feeling and logic are opposites and not compatible. Even though emotions might be difficult to define and to pin down, even sometimes to describe, to measure and to study, they still are central in learning, in memory formation, and in decision making. What if we saw the emotional brain and the higher thinking cortex not as adversaries and opposites, but as two sides of the same coin? The limbic brain tells us what is significant, what we like, and therefore what we value. Without the amygdala and the limbic brain, how would we know what is important to us? It would be very difficult to choose from alternatives if we had no emotions or values to guide us. If you think of it this way, you can see that our emotions are key to decision making, learning, and thinking. So I'm not suggesting that we throw out reason and logic when we're making decisions, but I am pointing out that it is our limbic brain that tells us what we like, what we love, what we enjoy, and therefore what is significant. That can be a sensory experience, a person, or even an ideal. But in order to talk about emotions, at least we need to have some common idea, some definition. So let's begin with this one. An emotion is a mental and physiological feeling state that directs our attention and guides our behavior. Okay, that's acceptable. Here's another word that you need to know: affect, the experience or feelings of emotions. This also guides our lives, informs our decisions, and has a major influence on our physical and mental health. So affect is not a synonym for an emotion per se, but it refers to the entire experience of emotions. So the affective part of a person, which would be their emotional life. Before we go further and look at the theories, let's take a look at the brainstem. And this is a little bit of a review of what you've already learned from the last module. So here is the brainstem that takes care of the automatic processes such as breathing, body temperature, blood pressure, and lots more. Its main job is to handle the automatic functions that are vital to our physical survival. The brainstem connects your spinal cord to the brain. This next structure that is important to us over here, the cerebellum, receives information from the spinal cord and other parts of the brain, and its job is to regulate motor movements such as posture, balance, coordination, and even speech. If the cerebellum is damaged, a simple act of bringing a fork to the mouth would be very challenging. The cerebellum also plays a role in motor learning and retaining those memories. The tennis player, or pick whatever sport, who makes the perfect shot because of practice and skill is using the power of the cerebellum. The limbic system is the HQ of emotions, the headquarter of emotions, with the amygdala being at the action central place and the thalamus operating much like a dispatch at a taxi company. The stimulus comes into the limbic system from the brain stem and then to the thalamus. From there, the thalamus will choose either the fast pathway, which is down to the amygdala, or the slower pathway, which is up to the thinking part of our brain, the cerebral cortex, and specifically to the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that is like the CEO or the master planner of everything that we do. If the fast pathway is chosen, then the stimulus goes directly to the amygdala, and there is going to be an immediate and usually intense emotional response. Why? Well, because the prefrontal cortex was left out of the information loop, so it had no time to process or to think anything, only react. You can surely see why nature designed this fast pathway. Without it, we would not have survived. When a threat is imminent, there's no time to think. There's just time to react. If the thalamus sends the signal via the slow pathway, then you become aware of your aroused state and the event. because the thalamus sent the stimulus to the prefrontal cortex. And now we are thinking about the emotions and the situation as well. When the eyes see a stick on the path in front of us, and if the stimulus is sent via the fast pathway, you'll jump out of the way, fearing a poisonous snake is about to strike. But you won't even be thinking about it. You're just going to simply react quickly. But if the stimulus is sent via the slow pathway, your prefrontal cortex will have time to think and to realize that it's only a stick and not a snake. In the last module, you learned that the prefrontal cortex was the brain's master planner and the seat of self-regulation. You also learned that the PFC, prefrontal cortex, enabled little children to control the impulse to eat the marshmallow. Can you imagine a situation in your life where you can use the power of the PFC instead of letting the amygdala hijack your emotions and your behavior? Think about that. So with that review of the limbic brain and the two pathways, fast and slow, we're now ready to learn about the three theories of emotions. Actually, there are many more theories than three, but these theories are constantly being challenged and replaced, as they should, with newer theories. With our improved tools that let us see into the brain, measure blood flow and skin response, we now have knowledge that was not possible for us to have before. So these theories all wonder about the order of events, which came first, the thought or the feeling or the physical response that we call arousal. The first theory is called the James-Lange Theory, after two people, William James, who you saw at the beginning of this presentation, and Carl Lange, a Danish psychologist and physiologist. This theory claims that the sequence of events in an emotion is the opposite to what our subjective experience or common sense experience tells us. Namely that first the body is aroused, and by aroused I mean increased heart rate, cheeks blushing, arms trembling, a tightening in the chest, a nauseous feeling in the stomach, and everything else that you can imagine and that you probably have also experienced. So first the body is aroused, and only then do we perceive and interpret the experience as an emotion. In William James's own words, he says, "We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, and afraid because we tremble." This theory suggests that different patterns of bodily arousal created by the autonomic nervous system all produce different feelings. So there would be an arousal pattern for fear, an arousal pattern for love, and then an arousal pattern for anger. So this might seem counterintuitive at first, but if you think about all the times when you were aware of a physical response and not really sure what you were feeling, you might see that, well, perhaps there is some validity to this theory. We know that that happens. Some support for this theory is found in people who have had spinal cord injuries and report having reduced emotional responses because their bodily arousal is also diminished. There's also some support for the theory that different emotions are produced by different physical arousal states. People who look at scary images show more amygdala response than people who look at pleasant, happy images. And we know that different hormones are released when we experience love. For example, oxytocin is the hormone that helps a woman produce breast milk. And when she breastfeeds, her body is flooded with oxytocin. This is another one of nature's very smart designs to make sure that mothers fall in love with their young and care for them. We also know that after sex and orgasm, both the male and female experience the release of oxytocin that promotes bonding and intimacy between them. So there is some evidence for different states of bodily arousal that create different emotions, and this gives credibility to the James-Lange theory of emotions. The next theory comes from Walter Canon and Philip Bard. Canon was a Harvard physiologist and Bard was his doctoral student. They disagreed that emotions were reactions to physiological bodily aroused states, as James and Lange had suggested. Instead, the emotion and the physiological response, or the bodily arousal, they thought were separate processes that occurred at exactly the same time. So in the Canon theory, we feel an emotion and the bodily response simultaneously. They disagreed that different bodily states of arousal produce different emotions, because these different bodily states are not sufficiently different from each other to allow people to distinguish one emotion from another. In other words, you could easily confuse the fast heartbeat and the sweaty palms for either anxiety about public speaking or the presence of an attractive person in whom you are romantically interested. The last theory we will look at is the schacter-singer theory, or sometimes called the TwoFactor Theory. In the 1960s, Stanley Schachter and Jerome Singer concluded that the early theories of emotions forgot an important factor, namely our own cognitive interpretation. Cognitive means thinking. According to them, two things must happen in order for a person to feel an emotion. Number one, there must be some kind of a physiological response, a bodily arousal. And number two, there must be a cognitive interpretation or an evaluation of that bodily arousal so that the person could label it as a specific emotion. That's why it's called the two-factor theory. Schachter and Singer concluded that people needed to find a reason or an explanation for why they felt a particular emotion. We need to label the state as an emotion that is appropriate to the situation at the time. In the 1970s, the University of British Columbia did a study that you'll read about in the online textbook, where male participants were asked to cross the Capilano suspension bridge, a naturally fear-provoking activity, as you can imagine. The wobbly bridge tilted and swayed over a 230-foot drop to the rocks and the shallow rapids below. Halfway through the crossing, when heart rate is accelerated and body is aroused, an attractive female interviewer approached the male participants, asking them to help her in her psychology experiment. The help meant simply looking at a picture and then writing a brief explanation of what they thought was happening in the picture. After they did this, she thanked them and gave them her telephone number, inviting them to call her if they had any questions about the study and her psychology experiment. Now, the same experiment was repeated on a control bridge that did not tilt or sway and was constructed of heavy wood only about 10 feet above a very small creek. The study predicted that the participants crossing the Capilano suspension bridge would be more aroused and more likely to interpret this arousal as attraction to the female psychology student than the men crossing this very simple little wooden bridge. Indeed, the study found that more men crossing the suspension bridge called the female psychology student than those who crossed the less scary wooden bridge. So this is called the misattribution of arousal. And it's the process by which people make mistakes in assuming what is causing them to feel aroused. For example, when actually experiencing the physiological responses related to fear, people might mislabel those responses as a romantic arousal. Arousal can be intense and confusing, and people can mistakenly explain the arousal they experience because of the context of the situation. So let's recap. There are 4 components in these theories of emotion. The stimulus, let's take for example the sound of a gunshot. The bodily arousal, like rapid heart rate. The cognitive appraisal, or the evaluation of what that thing means. And finally, the subjective experience of that emotion. So in the James-Lange theory, the sound of the gunshot, for example, leads to a physiological response, like rapid heart rate, that then leads to the subjective experience of fear. On the other hand, according to the Canon theory, the sound of a gunshot, for example, leads to both the physiological response and the subjective experience of fear at the same time. And according to the two-factor theory of Schachter and Singer, the stimulus leads to the arousal that is labeled using the cognition that leads to the emotion. The sound of a gunshot, for example, leads to the physiological response like rapid heart rate and trembling that are interpreted as fear, and that leads to the subjective experience of fear. To review, James-Lange and Canon theories are somewhat similar in that they both involve the same three components, but they are different in how they handle the timing of the arousal of when the emotion occurs. They differ from the two-factor theory in that neither of them explicitly acknowledge any role of cognition. Paul Ekman proposed his theory of basic human emotions found in all cultures that reflect the same facial expressions. He traveled throughout the US, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. And in each location, he showed people photographs of different facial expressions and asked them to match the images with 6 different emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, fear, and disgust. People tended to match the smiling faces with happiness, the furrowed-browed, tight-lipped faces with anger, and so on. According to Ekman's theory, these basic universal emotions are unlearned, and they emerge in childhood according to a set biological timetable. They are, as I've just said, fear, anger, disgust, surprise, happiness or joy, sadness or distress. This theory suggests that there are certain neural circuits in the brain that underlie these basic emotions. Can you guess which emotions are being expressed here? From the upper left to the upper right. If you guessed anger, fear, and disgust, you were right. What about the bottom row? From the bottom left to the bottom right. And if you guessed surprise, happiness, and sadness, you're right. Of course, not everyone agreed with his theory. Margaret Need, the famous anthropologist, criticized Ekman's theory. She, among many others, maintained that culture can override the biological circuits of emotions, and what might be anger in one culture will not be expressed as anger in another. Each culture has its own set of display rules concerning the expression of emotions. For example, in some cultures, people don't smile in photographs. In other cultures like Japan, negative emotions are hidden by a smile, so Japanese will pay more attention to the tone of voice than the actual facial expression. Ekman's theories have been largely accepted and are very popular. You might know the TV series Lie to Me that was based on Ekman and his theories of micro-expressions, those minuscule rapid twitches of facial expressions which reveal our true emotions. If you can read these micro-expressions, you'll be able to catch a liar. The face is not the only place to look at when ascertaining someone's true emotions. In your online book, in Table 11.1, in this chapter, you will see the book talks about nonverbal cues like paralanguage, like gestures, like body positioning, proximity, and so on. Your book has a small section on facial feedback. It's very interesting, so make sure to read it. In a nutshell, it says that if you put on a happy face, you can actually create a happy feeling. Listen to this interview with Dr. Paul Ekman. The link is on the last slide in this presentation that you can find on our class website. So this has been a long and perhaps challenging introduction to the theory of emotions. We've only just begun to talk about emotions. We're going to be looking at emotions and motivation, emotions and learning, emotions and self-mastery, emotions and mental health. But this is a good starting point. It might seem confusing at first, but remember that psychology is a science. And as new data and new tools become available, we have to amend our theories. And theories are meant to be challenged. One thing that we know for sure is that it's important to understand emotions, your own and others. This is how we communicate. This is how we develop empathy. This is the social glue of relationships, of families, of societies. And this is what makes us human. Because they're difficult to study doesn't mean that we will not continue piercing the mystery of what really is an emotion.